Anastasia, yes, the proverbial human choice. Rigdon, such manipulation is typical not only for religions but for many occult societies as well. The Latin word occultus means hidden. In the overwhelming majority of cases, such societies attract those who yearn to possess supernatural powers to satisfy their egoism. By the way, if people pay attention to the history of development of aggressive secret societies which seek to achieve absolute power, they will notice that even the names of many of them are connected with the images of the right and the left essences. For example, the secret societies of the dragon, jaguar, leopard, tiger, wolf. Moreover, their mystical foundation is made up of the rituals related to the right and the left essences. The essence of these rituals is to endow a person with the characteristics and supernatural power of whichever aggressive beast is honored in this society. It is the personal choice of members of such societies that plays the dominant role here, as well as their ideological or religious faith and ancient magical techniques for using the capabilities of the right and the left essences which, as a rule, are known only to the leaders of such a secret society. This is one of the numerous examples of how spiritual knowledge was usurped by individuals and began to be used in a perverted version for the purpose of attaining earthly power and personal material goals. As the ancients said, a slave has only one master, whereas a power-loving person has as many masters as there are people who contribute to his rise in earthly power and spirits who contribute to the downfall of his soul. Anastasia, I'm convinced once again how important it is that the majority of people understand who is who in this world, are able to distinguish the true spiritual from material substitution, the truth from a lie, good from evil. Rigdon, yes, humanity would then have more chances to avoid disastrous consequences for the civilization in general. After all, rules of the game in the material world, including those for occult societies, are based on the choice of mankind itself, or rather, its majority. Various occult powers only provoke or initiate certain actions, that is, they only launch a program of this or that will. But it is people themselves who make these programs a reality of their own choosing by performing corresponding actions and by spending on it the time of their transient lives and the force intended for the salvation of their soul. And in order to be able to distinguish between the truth and falsehood in the world, one must work on oneself, keep track of one's thoughts and control them, and learn to see the world from the perspective of the observer from the spiritual nature. Many people who are searching for the spiritual do not even understand that the system of the archons directs their mind in a totally opposite direction, making them spend years and energy on material temporary comforts instead of the real salvation of the soul. As it stands today, unfortunately, most people choose the reign of the animal mind which has seduced them with material desires. They unconsciously make its will a reality with their erroneous choice of what is transient and meaningless, and with their own hands support and strengthen the power of the archons. Look what is being popularized in the world, what substitutions take place. There are numerous signboards and slogans all around which induce multiple material desires and stimulate the ego. But a person is actually chasing not after material acquisitions, but rather, after the sensation of possessing this illusion and the desire to achieve the long-awaited stability in his inner world. But this stability depends solely on the inner work on yourself, on your spiritual self-perfection, and not on external circumstances. Here is a simple example. Close your eyes and imagine that you have everything, palaces, corporations, power over people. And then open your eyes, look around, and you will understand that this was an illusion that has ended very quickly. Life will also fly by and everything will end very quickly. So is it worth burdening your own soul for the sake of this illusion and condemning yourself to a lengthy agony after death and to torment for centuries in the form of a bundle of negative emotions which you yourself have created in yourself while chasing after illusions of the animal nature? Suffice it to take a look at the world around us, what substitutions the animal mind creates for those who seem to want to move in the direction of spiritual self-perfection, while at the same time wishing material things. For the most part, these people are unstable in their intention and their spiritual impulses are easily redirected into the channel of material interests. Note what such people seek in their everyday lives and what they pay attention to, assigning to it the status of top priority in their day. Some are preoccupied with strengthening their personal influence on people, asserting their own significance, profiting from spiritual knowledge. Others are busy with cleansing their bodies, arguing themselves hoarse about vegetarianism. Still others are focused on losing weight or practicing different health improvement systems with selfish ambitions and empty inner content. Some people cling to sects or religious movements, once again delighting their ears with false promises of resurrection in their beloved bodies. Others meditate, attracting wealth, luck, happiness, and health. Some, because of the domination of the animal nature and out of foolishness, begin to consider themselves enlightened and competent in many spiritual matters, to combine different meditation techniques they know, mixing the sinful with the righteous. And what is the basis of all this? Pride and affirmation of personal significance in the three-dimensional world, a secret desire of power over someone. Anastasia, yes, substitutions today take place on a global scale. Suffice it to look at what particular psycho-techniques are being promoted in society and popularized by the world media in order to verify this personally. After all, these are mostly the usual methods of archons, so to say, meditations for the masses to attract material benefits. Rigden, the sad thing is that most people do not even ask themselves why is it that such a material trend is being cultivated. Why is no money being spared to promote such ideas, buying the necessary expert opinions of globally known people? Why do these ideas pivot on pleasing one's beloved body and creating comfort around oneself and the egoistic little world of a self-lover? The answer is simple, so that a person would imitate this behavior and spend time and energy of his life on, roughly speaking, a tastier banana, and at the same time so that his hair is glossy and shining. However, like in any deception, nobody explains what consequences await the person later, after he has wasted his life like a silly monkey on the search of a tasty banana, and his beloved body will simply die, just like any animal. But he as a personality will not escape from his sufferings and will have to pay too high a price for the wasted life. And what is daily spiritual work on yourself? First of all, it is the habit of controlling your own thoughts and not judging other people's thoughts. Man, as a rule, often notices manifestations of the animal nature in another person, but does not bother to pay equally careful attention to himself, does not try to come to know his own reactions to internal and external provocations of the animal nature, and does not find it necessary to work hard on himself in each day. Only by changing yourself internally and working on yourself can you understand the real processes of the visible and invisible worlds and consciously walk the spiritual path. In other words, inner changes must be, first of all, in the person himself. This is the meaning of his spiritual development. Everything else is secondary. The body should certainly be taken care of just like any other machine, but only for the purpose of reaching the goal. No more than that. It is necessary to know and keep in view the true goal of your life, which is spiritual liberation. This is the most important thing for any person. When man begins to know himself, he begins to learn about the complexity of his structure and its purpose. One can say that everything favors a person to make his conscious choice and become a new spiritual being. An important role in this transformation is played by his four main essences. Anastasia, yes, different nations of the world have quite a lot of information recorded in various rituals, mystic practices, and sacred legends regarding the four essences and the spiritual center. Incidentally, according to different stories, every nation would place these four essences, orienting the front essence towards a certain part of the world. Could you explain this moment to the readers? Why did people, who inhabited different parts of the globe, have their own understanding of this orientation? Rigden, generally speaking, the orientation of these four essences according to cardinal directions, assigning a particular color to them, and so on depended on local traditional preferences, customs, and common beliefs of this or that people, which were formed for centuries based on the sacred folk tales of their ancestors. For instance, the Chinese considered the south to be the most honorable cardinal direction, so they placed the symbols that corresponded to the front essence towards the south. For shamans of the northern peoples, of Siberia, the main direction where they turned their faces, the front essence, during the performance of rituals was usually the north. Whereas for shamans of the southern and the eastern nations of Asia, it was the south or the east. The Indians of Mesoamerica regarded east or west as the main cardinal direction, depending on local traditions of certain tribes. In general, where a person traditionally turns his face while doing a spiritual practice, a religious ritual, ceremony, and so on is where his front essence is. Certainly, while reading ancient myths, one should understand where there is folklore and where there is real knowledge, because many superficial, confusing things from the human mind were added with time, mainly as a result of a literal understanding of associative examples. But nevertheless, even today one can find many interesting mentions, including those regarding the secret knowledge about the four essences of a human being. Anastasia, such knowledge can be found in totemic sources and mythological conceptions of the peoples of Europe, Asia, Africa, and America. Rigden, quite right. In most cases, small nations which live on different continents, as a result of their rather long isolation from contacts with representatives of the civilized society, due to unfavorable climate or inaccessibility of their settlements to travelers, were able to preserve the knowledge of their ancestors. In some sense, this saved them, since the civilization had no idea about the existence of these peoples and their cultures. Consequently, their unique knowledge has not been totally destroyed with fire and sword by the latest new religion that was dominant in the world civilization, as was the case with the ancient knowledge of other peoples. Anastasia, yeah, well, as they say, every cloud has a silver lining. But at the same time, now there is an excellent opportunity to compare what once existed in the past with what we have today, and to ask ourselves the question why representatives of all the modern religions claim that only they and no one else in the world has spiritual knowledge. If we approach this question objectively and look into it in the state of an expanded perception of the world, it will then become obvious that the knowledge everywhere was one and the same. It's just that people gave different form to it and called it their own. After all, any renewed spiritual teaching was, in fact, formed consistent with the main secret knowledge that had been given to different peoples in the past. And it is only when priests had altered this knowledge and clothed it into a form of the dominant religion that ideology changed. In fact, they were narrowing perception of the world for nations, right up to provoking fanaticism in the masses and thoughtless destruction of the heritage of their ancestors, of all that did not conform to the canons of the new religion. Rigden, undoubtedly. But here is what I want to point out. Despite such work by the priesthood on the destruction of the spiritual heritage of different peoples and indoctrination of new generations with the idea that all the previous beliefs are apostasy and heresy, basic knowledge about the four essences is present in the secret knowledge of practically all the world religions today. This can be seen from the indirect evidence of what is currently being offered to the masses in the teaching, philosophy, and ideology of this or that religion. It must be understood that priests of any religion will impose on the masses only what is beneficial to them and what will strengthen their power among the people, and not all that knowledge which their predecessors themselves once borrowed from other popular religions. Moreover, priests will never spread among the masses the original spiritual teaching which independently leads a person to spiritual liberation. But it is on the basis of attractive spiritual grains of this teaching that they form one or another religion. When religion itself as an institute of power is formed, much gets reworked in the original teaching and changed for the sake of the religious power of priests. For example, let us take Buddhism. At first sight, while reading the general philosophy of Buddhism, it seems that this world religion puts an emphasis on man's independent cognition of the world and of himself. After all, it represents for the masses a wide variety of practices which lead to enlightenment and which, by the way, has been formed on the basis of the knowledge of other more ancient religions of India. But this sensation lasts only until you face the realities of today in this religion as well as the priestly structure of this world religion. If a person does not distinguish between the spiritual nature and his animal nature, if he does not see substitutions from the animal mind, it is difficult for him to understand what the catch is and what significant difference there is between, for instance, the original teaching of Buddha and the religion of Buddhism, which has, so to speak, appropriated this teaching. So, the four essences of human are mentioned both in the all-Indian sacred tradition and in the Buddhist religious interpretation of Buddha's teaching. Among the supreme knowledge in religious teachings about meditation practices in Hinduism and Buddhism are, attainment of intuitive knowledge, superconsciousness, in Sanskrit, in the English transcription it sounds like abhijna, cognition of the world through a special altered state of consciousness, the state of integrity, unity, samadhi. Attainment of intuitive knowledge is interpreted as perception of the truth, the unity of the world, achieving oneness of the five categories, clairvoyance, clairaudience, having supernatural powers, reading other people's thoughts, and the memory of past lives. It is mentioned that an accomplished person is capable of influencing this entire material world right up to the seventh dimension or, as the ancient Indian treatises state, right up to the heavens of Brahma. After all, the path to the heavens of Brahma starts with renunciation of attachment to the six worlds of passion of the will of life. Anastasia, in fact, this oneness of five categories describes the result of work with the four main essences and the center, the personality. As a matter of fact, the outcome of a certain stage of spiritual work of man is considered here, when these essences are already under his control and the person approaches the state of escaping the six dimensions. Rigden, just so. Man, working on himself, changing and perfecting himself in the spiritual direction, achieves certain effects which give him additional capabilities in knowing the world. Anastasia, yes, for instance, in the process of mastering spiritual practices, the personality, the center, acquires the ability of clairvoyance, that is, of contemplation with its inner vision from the perspective of the observer of the spiritual nature of any existing forms, regardless of distance and time, as well as of seeing the real essence of an event or a phenomenon. That is really so, taking into account even my practical experience of meditation for more than 20 years and also the experience of those people with whom I had the honor of learning your teaching. And that primordial spiritual knowledge which you have communicated. Such clairvoyance assumes, among other things, simultaneous contemplation of an object in different dimensions, understanding the underlying cause of its appearance, transformation, and so on. Achieving such a state of intuitive knowledge, the person realizes how to control the front essence, which, in turn, manifests in him the ability to understand and intuitively feel any being from the perspective of the observer from the spiritual nature and also to make contact with it, regardless of space and time. Rigden, that is correct. In the religious interpretation of Buddhism, this is referred to as acquiring divine hearing, clairaudience, which allows one to understand people who speak unknown languages and to hear sounds of the world even at great distances. Thing is that the sound, according to Indian mythology, is a kind of a symbol connected with cosmic rhythms. The one listening to the sounds of the world is the one who knows them and who is able to extract cosmic rhythms. It is believed that everything is interconnected and is permeated with subtle cosmic vibrations. By changing himself and his small sphere, man makes changes in the bigger realm. Anastasia, well, yes. In principle, the person who judges phenomena of the world within the limits of thinking of a resident of three-dimensional space will perceive it as acquiring divine hearing. Indeed, the knowledge about the four essences is reflected in Buddhist philosophical teachings, although in somewhat embellished form, but nevertheless. Even if we consider the above-mentioned categories, clairvoyance, clairaudience, possession of supernatural powers, reading other people's thoughts, the memory of past lives, it turns out that each of those points at the capabilities of a particular essence. About this, I can judge by the practical experience of our group. For example, when we were learning the tunneling meditation technique, which involved work with the back essence, we actually were able to learn about our past and even partially read information about the past lives of our subpersonalities. In the Buddhist philosophy, the acquisition of memory of past lives implies the knowledge of your past births and the memory of your previous temporary states. Regarding the capabilities of the left and right essences, in our time we had a very good illustrative example, namely the spiritual work of those 4 warriors whom you were teaching the art of the AllatRA warrior. That was when I realized how a person's control over the left essence reveals in him such abilities as knowing and reading other people's thoughts. By and large, this is not only revelation of such abilities but also the perception of structures of the subtle world through feelings and also exercising influence through them. I clearly saw how restraining the right essence with a strict control of your thoughts and certain meditation practices leads to influencing the coarse structures of the world and to the opening of certain supernatural powers which, in fact, are a side effect acquired in the course of spiritual development. But most of all I was impressed by the spiritual fortitude of this group of 4. The acquisition of excellent professional skills did not shake their spiritual intentions which, unfortunately, cannot be said about some people with whom I had to work in subsequent groups. Of course, there were different situations, including the ones that brought enlightening learning experience. For instance, 2 years of hard work of my group gave concrete results. But this also exposed the fact that some people from the group, in fact, were not ready to reveal such phenomenal abilities in themselves. Their consciousness was taken over by momentary success, a sense of their own importance and pride. They started to secretly dream of their prospects related to the human world. In general, an imbalance in favor of the animal nature started. And the main thing is that sincerity was lost as well as the desire of achieving specifically the spiritual goal. There simply began verbal covering behind noble intentions against the background of evident attacks from the animal nature. Even the small success, in fact, triggered the loss of their control over the animal nature. But at the same time, this was a good lesson for those who are able to recognize their mistakes and who adhere firmly to the spiritual direction. Such experience grants the opportunity to walk the spiritual path in a more mature and conscious way afterwards. Rigdon, in fact, while going through the stage of learning the right and the left essences, instead of gaining control over them, human runs the risk of getting under control of these very clever essences if he is tempted by the desire to possess invisible power and control over other people. And as a consequence, get carried away with it and waste the rest of his life on achieving a temporary result, having thus lost the opportunity of his liberation, of escape from the circle of reincarnations. This is a kind of a trap for people who hesitate in their main choice. In this regard, there is an interesting parable about a treasure hunt. Once upon a time, a wise man was passing by a village. He told the villagers there that countless treasures were hidden under the ground directly below their main square. Whoever finds them will gain not only wealth but also, they will never be the same again. The villagers rejoiced at this news. There was much debate and lengthy discussions, but finally, the residents decided to dig up the treasures together. Armed with tools, they began to dig. However, after a while, when they still had no expected results from their labor, the villagers' enthusiasm began to fade. The first people to abandon the excavations were the ones who talked a lot, rather than actually doing anything themselves to find the treasures, they only tried to tell others how they should work. These were followed by people who quickly became exhausted by this hard work. They decided these treasures are not worth all this effort. There were others who started finding pieces of broken tiles, ancient crockery, and old coins. They hid what they had found from the rest, thinking these were the real treasures. And soon they had left sight too. Other people simply enjoyed the experience of the treasure hunt. They believed that these feelings of joy from the search must be the treasures promised by the wise man. Eventually, as time dragged on and only mud and rocks were strewn around them, their joy evaporated. So they turned their backs on this task, for they proved to be just too weak in spirit. As time went on, many of the remaining people started to doubt the possibility of success in their search. They began thinking that they had become prey to some deception or a mere myth. The villagers started leaving the treasure hunt site one by one. And only those few who were fixed on the goal, who worked diligently and hard, found their treasures in the end. But after they had found the treasures, none of them was seen in this village again. And those villagers, who had participated in the treasure hunt but had not found the treasure, for the rest of their lives, were preoccupied with self-justification and explanations of why they had not stayed with everyone back then. After all, it had been a chance to change their miserable lives for the better. Some of them spent the rest of their lives wandering in the search of that wise man who had originally revealed the secret of the treasure, hoping they could find out what the treasures looked like, where they were now, and how they could be possessed by them. So, the treasure is the spiritual transformation of man. To achieve it, it is necessary to work hard on yourself each day. Not everyone, who is attracted by the prospect of the path, reaches the end of it because the path involves internal changes. The first ones to leave the path are those who talk much but do nothing to transform themselves. They are followed by those who look for easy victories. Then those, who are tempted by the abilities that have opened up in them to satisfy their significance in this world, also stray from the spiritual path. They are followed by those who find pleasure in the very process of searching for the meaning of life but do not understand themselves and, as a result, they find nothing. Finally, those who doubt themselves. The sage that revealed the spiritual truth to them, and who even doubt the truth itself also walk away from the spiritual path. All these people interpret the spiritual path in some way which benefits them in this material world. It is only those who walk with pure and sincere intentions right to the end, persistent in their spiritual labor, transforming themselves in each day, only they find their spiritual treasures in life that make it possible for them to leave for another world. The parable teaches us that quite often, while following the spiritual path, people are merely seeking personal successes in this, temporary for them, world, instead of seeking their spiritual treasures, which open to them a way to eternity. Anastasia, yes, this is the truth of life, which was important not only in ancient times but also now. Everyone makes their own choice. Rigden, so, practice is a serious test. It is one thing to read religious legends and dream that you will become the same spiritual person like their characters, and it is quite another to really work on yourself in each day, do spiritual practices, and control your thoughts. In treatises of Buddhism, for example, the ability of a person to control his supernatural powers is called possessing miraculous powers. It is also said there that a perfect person can influence the world right up to the heavens of Brahma, the seventh dimension, and that the way to the heavens of Brahma starts with the renunciation of the attachment to the six worlds of passion of the will of life. For example, in the collection of the Buddhist sacred texts Tripitaka, there is a very interesting sutra called the Fruits of Reclusion. By the way, the word sutra, when translated from Sanskrit, literally means a thread on which pearls are strung. In ancient Indian literature, they called a fragmentary utterance so, and later, a collection of such utterances. However, while reading the collection of the Buddhist sacred texts Tripitaka, including the Sutra The Fruits of Reclusion, one must bear in mind that these texts contain not the actual words of Buddha but his teaching, which for a long time was passed down by word of mouth and which was written down later. Besides, as the religion of Buddhism was being formed, changes were made to it over the centuries. In other words, one must be aware of the fact that this is not the original information but already its interpretation by many minds over centuries. If a person is unaware of subtleties of the spiritual work and lacks practical experience of meditation, he will naturally be retelling, interpreting, or translating this information into other languages while being guided solely by his own worldview and his own understanding on this matter, so to say, from the perspective of a resident of a three-dimensional world. So, this sutra mentions Buddha's conversation with Ajatashatru, king of Magadha, of an ancient country that was once located in northeast India. The king asks Buddha what is the visible fruit of reclusion, that is, what is the result of doing spiritual practices in this world? Buddha, using everyday allegories that can be understood by a common man, recounts the teaching of the path which a monk, who is seeking to get to nirvana, walks as a person who is engaged in spiritual self-perfection and meditations. This sutra also mentions that a monk must follow the commandments of moral behavior. It tells about the joys of self-restraint and about the outcome of spiritual work on yourself. Furthermore, it emphasizes that the monk understands the result of the work with the mind which is in samadhi, a pure, clear one, obedient and collected, which has achieved dispassion. The state of samadhi, when translated from Sanskrit, means adding together, joining, integrity, unity. In the Indian philosophy, this state of enlightenment and supreme harmony is seen as the ultimate goal of meditation practices. In Buddhism, samadhi is considered to be the final stage of the Eightfold Path, which, according to their philosophy, must bring man right up to nirvana. This sutra also mentions, this body of mine has a shape and consists of four great elements. In philosophical discussions, the four great elements are usually interpreted as air, earth, water, and fire. Such allegories, by which the ancients meant the four main essences, were often used in sacred scriptures while discussing self-perfection of man and his energy structure which is invisible to the eye. Sutra 87 of the Fruits of Reclusion describes a manifestation of various superpowers in a person who has achieved the state of samadhi. He, being one, becomes many, and being many, becomes one. He becomes visible to the eye and invisible. He easily passes through walls, ramparts, mountains as if through the air. He penetrates the earth as if through water. He walks on water like on terra firma, without sinking. Sitting with his legs crossed, he ascends to the sky like a winged bird. He can touch the moon and the sun with his palm, although they are strong and powerful. Up to the heavens of Brahma he can exert influence by means of his body. It is not the physical body that is meant here. This sutra mentions what Buddhists call the acquired, phenomenal, mystical body. The Sanskrit name in English transcription is nirmanakaya, that is, a ghostly, transformed body of experiences. From this body of his, he creates another body which has a form, consists of the mind, is endowed with all the big and small parts, and which knows no detriment to vital abilities. At that, there is confusion even in this matter and endless theoretical discussions take place about what this phenomenal body really means, the body of transformation, of a different state of consciousness, the physical body of Buddha or Bodhisattva, a body of an illusion, manifestation, or the perfect potential of the mind as a physical form. Such disagreements indicate that people have lost the essence of the main knowledge and judge it only by the remaining external forms, and that coming from the human mind. But, in reality, everything is simple. The energy body, which is located in 6 dimensions, is approximately the same in humans. It has the form of a four-sided truncated pyramid with a detached top. It is just that most people do not see it and even do not know it exists. But it does not mean that it does not influence their lives, fate, and activity. As people say, as long as your liver does not ache, you don't think about it, if, of course, you know it exists. When a person works on himself, carries out spiritual practices, and takes daily care of the liberation of his soul, his energy structure changes and gradually transforms into a qualitatively different structure which I have already mentioned. And when the personality merges with the soul, a new spiritual being is formed, which no longer needs the material shell. In other words, thanks to this, a resident of 3-dimensional space becomes a resident of 7-dimensional space. Anastasia, from the standpoint of the gained spiritual experience and the understanding of the key to that primordial knowledge which you've given us, those arguments of theorists seem quite ridiculous. Sometimes the discussions described in their treatises resemble a situation with two students who have memorized different theories by heart and argue with each other, shouting themselves hoarse, about the essence of a practical production process. However, neither of them has personal experience of working in production, that is, there is no understanding of what production really is. Against the backdrop of such philosophical debate, those authors stand out who do not talk nonsense but who really share their practical spiritual experience with the world while striding along the spiritual path, even though intuitively at some points, but still in the right direction. One knows about this because one has personal practical experience. After all, acquiring your own practical experience helps to feel and to understand, as they say. Without further ado, those truly wise people who left their records through the ages, truly engaged in working on themselves in the process of walking their spiritual path. Rigdon, certainly, in this matter, there are no borders or divisions, time, or material space. What is present here is integrity and spiritual understanding, so to say, unity with the truth. So, different religions of India have preserved records in one form or another that during his spiritual development, man acquires certain miraculous powers, Buddhism, or Siddhi powers, Indian yoga, the ancient Indian word siddha means perfect. The concept of Siddhi is also present both in Jainism and Hindu mythology as the name of mythical semi-divine beings possessing preternatural magical powers and inhabiting air space. According to the ancient Indian Puranas, when translated from Sanskrit, Purana means ancient, a heroic epic story, which describe cosmological myths about the universe and outline Hindu philosophies. Semi-divine Siddhis have the following supernatural properties: they can become extremely light or heavy, infinitely small or large, they can immediately move to any point in space, achieve the desired with the power of thought, subjugate objects and time to their will, achieve the supreme power over the world. But mythology is merely camouflaged sacred knowledge about human and the world. Anastasia, so, basically, these are all echoes of the past knowledge about the mastering by man of practices to control his four essences. Rigdon, absolutely right. Moreover, they have already been thoroughly reworked by different religions. In fact, these supernatural miraculous powers in a spiritual practice are, one can say, a side effect when a person learns to control his right and left essences. It is the work of these essences in a certain, let us put it this way, mode of consciousness that manifests these superpowers in man. In Buddhist treatises, for instance, references have been preserved that having these powers, siddhis, as such is not harmful, for everything depends on man's choice, his desire. The treatises also say that Buddha himself warned monks against succumbing to various temptations in the process of unconditioning themselves. First of all, they would avoid demonstrating these miraculous powers to people who were not privy to these things so as not to cause confusion in the minds of unbelievers. Secondly and most importantly, they were to be wary of temptation to change their initial goal, escape to nirvana, to eternity. For empty human wishes, desire of power, magic takeover of the world, satisfying any material desires and needs, as well as longing for control and possession of anything, the possibilities of using these invisible powers for egoistic purposes, and taking advantage of events. In other words, Buddha warned those walking the spiritual path against any use of these miraculous powers for personal gain. Otherwise, a person will stray from the spiritual path and will not accomplish the main goal in his life, inner transformation, fusion with the Absolute, with the world of the soul. Why did Buddha emphasize this point? Buddha had a group of disciples who were mastering the high art as they called it, or as we say, Jalayarship. This is a difficult path of spiritual development and it is not meant for everyone. Figuratively speaking, this is like in reconnaissance, not everyone who wants to be is accepted there, but only the ones who have certain personal qualities, abilities, and already existing professional skills. However, other people knew about this group of Buddhas, as they say, ones who wished to but were not participating. There have always been plenty of imitators distorting the knowledge. It must be noted that during Buddha's time, just like nowadays, many people were keen on magic and various mystical arts of secret knowledge for the sake of their egoistic desire to have invisible power over people. But it is one thing to have supernatural powers for the sake of egoistic goals and pride, and quite another to use such abilities in service to the spiritual world. So, Buddha warned his disciples that, while passing the stages of inner transformation, it is necessary to firmly adhere to spiritual liberation, your main spiritual goal, that is, exit to nirvana, as the only meaning of human existence. Otherwise, one can fall into illusion and mistake the temporary for the eternal. Anastasia, yes, it was quite popular in ancient India for a person to acquire different supernatural powers one way or another. One can say, this was a publicity stunt to popularize different religions. For example, besides the Buddhist religion, this is present in esoteric dashan's teachings of the ancient Indian philosophy, which describes yogic methods of attaining the true knowledge by means of acquiring divine abilities through spiritual practices. In particular, esoteric schools still use such a notion as Shakti as a designation of the powers that can be acquired at various stages of the practices. For instance, Jnana Shakti means powers related to the properties of clairvoyance, clairaudience, telepathy. Kriya Shakti relates to materialization, the ability to heal or harm with the power of thought. Eka Shakti stands for manifestation of willpower and self-control, leading to the development of supernatural abilities of the body, ability to make astral trips. Mantra Shakti means powers related to cosmic rhythms and influence on nature. Rignan, exactly so. When translated from Sanskrit, Shakti means power, might. Ancient Indian legends, as I have already said, mention Shakti as the primary divine creating power of the feminine principle on the scale of the universe, Adi Shakti. In spiritual practices, this power is mentioned as forces endowed with the functions of Allat and humans' four essences. In religious legends, this creating force is represented in the form of goddesses who are the spouses of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, as well as an aspect in each and of every god. Interestingly, it is mentioned that this power, Shakti, branches into smaller forces represented by special signs on lotus petals, in which not only gods but also goddesses lie personally. For an uninformed person, such information looks like an ordinary religious legend. While a knowledgeable person understands perfectly what this means and what knowledge about macrocosm and man is outlined. As I have already said, ancient people, particularly in the East, allegorically compared the human energy structure to the lotus flower, where every conventional petal is one of the human essences which has its sign, lives its own life, and is responsible for the connection with a certain dimension. By knowing this sign, one can contact a specific essence directly. Anastasia, yes, many religions have echoes of this knowledge. It's just that they have been wrapped up into such a material philosophy that it is difficult for an uninformed person not only to separate but even to understand where spiritual grains are and where there are material additions from the human mind or substitutions from the animal mind. By the way, I recall that Chinese Taoism also regards the human body as a microcosm inhabited by various deities. Although they imagine this process in their own way, which, as they understand it, is associated with the physical body and its organs. Nevertheless, it is recommended for followers of Taoism to lead a righteous life and do good deeds supposedly in order to gain the goodwill of these spirits of the human body. Rignan, Taoism inherited this knowledge already from ancient Chinese shamanism, where there existed the idea of a multitude of souls of man, including the animal soul, Po, and the spiritual one, Hun, which the body bound together. But there is a significant difference here and a substitution of notions already since those times. Thing is that gaining the goodwill of spirits or coming to an agreement with them actually meant striking a deal with the animal mind, which, due to such implied contract, gave the person an opportunity to do certain magical things within the 6 dimensions. The person, shaman, naively believed that the spirits served him when actually he was the one who served as a conductor of the animal mind, and these spirits could change their attitude toward him at any moment. In other words, there is a significant difference between winning the favor of spirits, including your own lateral essences, In order to have supernatural powers in the material world in your transient life or learning to control your essences, gaining integrity and attaining spiritual liberation, eternity. In the religion of Taoism, just like in the religion of Buddhism, it is imposed on the follower as his obligation to be engaged in radical transformation of his body and consciousness and use meditations as an instrument of cognition. Taoism also emphasizes the fact that, thanks to such transformation on the path of attaining immortality, according to their religious teaching, man acquires supernatural powers and abilities. For example, he can become invisible, travel in space, appear simultaneously in several places, compress time, and so on. But what I would like to say in this regard. Indeed, many religious concepts mention that the follower, while walking the proposed religious path, can eventually learn to have certain supernatural abilities. This attracts many people precisely from the side of the animal nature, moreover, more than spiritual grains. But sadly, many people spend their entire lives on achieving this goal, gaining supernatural abilities, wasting their energy for nothing. However, having supernatural abilities is far from the peak of perfection. There is an ancient wisdom: when man does not know God in his soul, he is ready to believe in anything. To learn some supernatural abilities does not mean to attain spiritual liberation. After all, this can be done, for instance, by people engaged in black magic, that is, by the ones who are conductors of the animal mind. But what is the result? To become a subpersonality later and undergo even greater torment? After all, you will have to answer in double measure for all your actions both in the visible and in the invisible worlds. Developing supernatural abilities is justified only when the person himself does not pay close attention to this process, when he is focused on his spiritual path and spiritual liberation, and at the same time when he takes on, let us put it this way, an obligation to bear responsibility of a warrior of light from the spiritual world. But this path is only for very few. And mostly, people do not need to focus on having any supernatural powers. The main thing for people in their lives is to concentrate their efforts on spiritual liberation, which means spiritual work on themselves in each day. That is the most important thing. You should prove not to people that you are better than others at something, but to prove to God that you are worthy of being accepted into the spiritual world, that you are worthy of having your personality abide in eternity as a mature spiritual being. Anastasia, yes, many religions also point at the fact that these abilities are revealed at the last stage of attainment of the truth when, as it happens, they are basically no longer needed for earthly purposes. Rigdon, just so. When the fusion of the personality with the soul takes place and the seventh dimension becomes accessible to man, he already lives in it with consciousness and abides in the spiritual world. He loses all interest in the three-dimensional world, for he begins to learn all the most interesting things in the spiritual world. Generally speaking, the entire spiritual journey of man is a path of his inner conscious changes, of his radical transformation of himself. When the personality begins its journey, it does not understand many things and follows the path by intuition. Everyone bumps into their own obstacles in the process of spiritual movement and learns to overcome them. Cognizing himself, man begins to understand the invisible side of his life, the previously uncontrolled activity of his own essences which gave rise to not the best events in his life. So the personality realizes the root of its sufferings. When man begins to understand more than is favorable to his animal nature, he ignores the needs of his egoistic existence and cultivates the habit of continual readiness to repel its attacks. Over time, this work on oneself bears spiritual fruit. It is no coincidence that it has been said, thought, which is well guarded, is the bearer of happiness. Personal choice plays a major role in a person's life. Thoughts are always dominated by that to which the personality is not indifferent. Man should monitor the situation in himself more often, observe what he thinks about, and ask himself what he chooses here and now, the suffering of this world or the eternity for himself and his soul. After all, the most important thing in life is the Salvation of one's soul. By saving his soul, man also saves himself. Life, even the longest one, ends very quickly, and it ends suddenly. Its every moment in the material world devours time mercilessly. By the way, the Sanskrit word ad, the Russian transcription of the word hell, means to eat, to devour, and to consume, or using the old Russian word, gorge, translator's note. Ancient people regarded this material world as that very place which religions today call hell, and it was depicted as a monster which devours people, their fates, and souls. But if a person yearns day and night to save his soul and works on himself each day, then this gives him a chance to forever leave the boundaries of the material world, to go beyond suffering and constant rebirths. In order to save your soul, it is necessary to live by this desire. This must be the only dominant desire of man in his life, regardless of the circumstances of fate. But human, as a rule, even when he steps on the spiritual path, walks along it with a load of numerous banal earthly wishes, among the temptations of which it is somewhat difficult for him to keep that only wish that comes from the spiritual nature. So his questions often come from the mind. There is a good parable in this regard. A young man once came to a sage who was sitting in the lotus position at a river bank. He decided to pay his respects to the sage and to show with his whole appearance and mind that he was ready to become his disciple. The young man considered it necessary to ask him the question which, as he thought, the sage would certainly answer, and thus turn his attention to him. The young man asked, "What should I do to become wise and save my soul?" But on the contrary to his expectations, the sage did not reply to him, just like to other people who were coming up to him almost the entire day, asking their questions, complaining about problems, or simply expressing their respect to him. The young man decided to persevere, and so, every time somebody asked the sage about something, he repeated his important question again and again. But the sage still remained silent. It so happened that towards the evening, a poor man carrying a heavy load approached the sage, who was still sitting in the lotus position, and asked which road he needed to take in order to reach the nearest town. The sage quickly rose to his feet, hoisted the poor man's load onto himself, took him to the road, pointed the direction, and explained in detail how to get to the town. Then he came back and sat down to meditate again. The young man was so amazed by what had happened that he started asking the sage desperately, "How so? Why have you replied to this man's mundane question and spared him so much time, while I spent the whole day asking you a more important question about the salvation of the soul, but you have given me no answer?" The sage stood up and gestured for the young man to follow him towards the river. He entered the water. The young man followed him reluctantly, although the water was cold and the wind was piercing. The sage went into a sufficient depth. He turned to the young man and suddenly seized him by the shoulders. He then quickly immersed the young man into the water up to the top of his head, despite the latter's desperate attempts to break free from his strong arms. Finally, the sage released the young man, who, after hastily resurfacing, started to breathe greedily and could not get enough. The sage calmly asked, "When you were under the water, what did you desire the most in your life?" The young man blurted out without hesitation, "Air. I wanted only air." The sage clarified, "Was it only air? Perhaps, at that moment you would instead have preferred to have wealth, fame, pleasures, significance among people, or power over them." The young man almost cried, "What? I longed only for air and was thinking only about air. Without it, I would have died." The sage nodded at the young man contentedly and replied, "Now then, in order to become wise, you must desire to save your soul just as strongly as you were just wishing for air to save your life. This must be your only goal, for which you must fight in your life. This must be your only aspiration both day and night. If you work on yourself for the sake of saving your soul with the same fervor as you have now been fighting underwater for your life, you will definitely become wise and save yourself." Having said these words, he started to come out of the water, in which the young man, who began to see clearly after the sage's words, was still standing, no longer noticing neither the cold nor the piercing wind. The sage, after reaching the bank, looked back and said, "As for the common man with the load, I helped him only because today he was the only one out of everyone who was really searching for exactly what he was asking about." Anastasia, it's a marvelous parable, and it describes very accurately both secret desires of many people who only dream of the spiritual path and the state of a person who truly craves spiritual salvation and does much for it. Rigden, the journey of attaining inner freedom always begins with a first step. At the initial stages of cognition, the person is indeed full of many banal earthly wishes which are so tempting that, without having practical spiritual experience, it is difficult for him to maintain that only aspiration which comes from the spiritual nature. The mistake of many is that at the first stages they do not even notice that they treat the spiritual not as their main path but as some addition to their lives which in a sense have already been formed according to habits, certain patterns of thinking, and so on. There is a big difference here. It is one thing to really change yourself and your habits and another to wish to acquire greater importance in this world with the help of this knowledge without changing yourself. When man knows nothing about his spiritual, each day he is being filled drop by drop, like a jug, with evil thoughts, defective feelings, and empty wishes. As a result, this mass of material dirt reshapes his further destiny. And when a person is walking the spiritual path, he watches, figuratively speaking, the purity of his thoughts drops, with which he fills his consciousness daily, giving attention to them and confirming his choice. With time, his consciousness gets into the habit of concentrating only on kind thoughts and feelings. The personality becomes like a young green sprout at dawn which gathers for itself life-giving crystal clear dew drops, which nourish it with moisture and stimulate its rapid growth and eventually allow it to become an independent plant. Daily work on yourself makes it possible to acquire spiritual experience in the invisible world which gives an understanding of your past, for example, why states of depression, dissatisfaction with life, etc. took place. It becomes clear why man, wishing to be better, at the same time feels a nearly animal fear about anything that may threaten to change his usual way of life. With the help of spiritual tools, a person learns to control his thoughts and control his main four essences. Developing spiritually, he begins to understand the visible and the invisible worlds through the deepest feelings, already not from the perspective of his mind limited in matter, but from the perspective of the spiritual, intuitive knowledge which covers a wider range of information about the world and makes it possible to maintain a constant connection with the soul, the portal to the world of God. Man's intentions in the attainment of the spiritual path become like a solid rock which cannot be moved by winds of doubt.